I found that a fourth of cowboys in the West during the heyday were Black, but most literature and film cut them out. And so anyway, it just really allowed me to tell history from a different angle. And of course, there are people who write, all different perspectives of history. But when I was looking at what was seeming very popular, it concerned me that a lot of people are not choosing those perspectives. And so I guess that this book is sort of putting it out there as one example of how shifting our lens and looking at a different perspective can really enrich our understanding of what actually happened and how our country actually came to be.
As a young mother, I experienced a paradigm shift that transformed how I saw education and ultimately the world around me. I started this podcast, The Luminous Mind, to connect with and learn from people who are disrupting the status quo in how they learn, educate, and live in the world around them. Prepare for a paradigm shift. Light a candle, light your world.
Benjamin Franklin said, "Instead of cursing the darkness, light a candle." You're listening to The Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's Firestarter is Julia Soplop. A fascination with animal behavior has led writer and photographer Julia Soplop around the globe. So naturally, when her daughter started riding lessons, the horse's behavior immediately drew Soplops in. What began as a casual interest rapidly escalated into amassing a collection of horse literature, dashing around the country to photograph wild horses, and ultimately writing her new book, Equus Rising: How the Horse Shaped U.S. History. Soplop's work has appeared in numerous publications, including National Geographic Magazine Online, Design Mom, Skiing, and the Summit Daily News. She's also the author of Curriculum, Documenting Your World Through Photography. She has a BA in French from Duke University and an MA in Medical Journalism from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She lives with her family and her sprightly hedgehog outside of Chapel Hill. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Well, welcome to our podcast. I'm so excited that you elected yourself to come on to the podcast and talk about your work and some of the stuff that you do, as well as how you do all of that with homeschooling your kids. But before we get started, just briefly tell our audience a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Minnesota. And I have always been a writer and a photographer. When I was 6 years old, I really got into writing. And then the next year, I got a camera as a gift for my birthday, and I got really into photography. And I especially loved documenting nature and animals and animal behavior. And so those passions I've always had and have always been a part of my life. I have also always loved to travel. And that, in combination with my interest in animal behavior, has kind of taken me all over the world. I've done field research on lemurs in Madagascar. I've photographed wild horses in Montana and Wyoming, and studied sea turtles on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So that is sort of, for a long time, I kind of felt like those were competing interests, this interest in biology and in writing and photography. And it kind of took me until late college to realize that I didn't have to choose any one of those things. I could combine my interests. And so I ended up getting a degree in medical journalism, which was a kind of a combination of classes in the journalism school and in the public health school, and writing for a lot of different publications related to health and science, and for some organizations as well, especially in global public health. And then it got married and started having kids. And I thought, well, I want to be home with my kids. I really wanted to be home with them, but I also wanted to have a creative outlet. And my first thought, well, I'm going to have this brilliant freelance career where when the baby naps, isn't this something we all sort of think we're going to do? When the baby is napping, I'm going to be interviewing these, high profile experts, and then I'm going to be writing these brilliant articles and everything. And the first article I tried to write when my oldest was a baby was, I had carefully scheduled so that I was going to do this interview. It was going to take about 20 or 30 minutes. It was going to be right at her exact nap time. And I worked all morning to get her on her schedule, and she went to sleep. right on time. And I called the person at the allotted time, and the person's assistant said, "Oh, she's on another call. Can she call you back in 20 or 30 minutes?"
Oh my gosh.
I said, "Oh no." And somehow I got through, but the baby was awake and I was rocking her with my foot while I was interviewing. It was so stressful. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is going to be harder than I thought. And so I retooled a bit, and I ended up opening a small photography and design business called Calm Cradle Photo and Design. And that was about 8 years ago. And that's been something that I've done on the side while raising my 3 girls. And I could really manage my time and take exactly the amount of work that I could handle and could do while still caring for them in the way that I wanted to. And then more recently, they're now 9, 8, and 4. And I kind of found that they are much more independent, and I could sort of get back to doing bigger projects that took more hours of my time. And that's when I started working on this book.
That's awesome. And I'm so excited to hear about your whole journey on that. So give us more background into how you became interested in exploring horses as part of that influence in history.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny because I'm kind of an unlikely person to write a book about horses. I did not grow up around horses. Really, my only experience with them as a kid was like riding a couple weeks at summer camp when I think I was in middle school. But I really wasn't bitten by the bug like a lot of people are. And it was kind of a combination of things that happened at the same time that got me interested in the horse. One is, like I said, I'm really interested in animal behavior. And for several years now, we live in North Carolina, and we go on an annual trip to the Outer Banks, our barrier islands, every summer. And there are a few herds of wild horses out there. And we started visiting them every year. And I'd bring my camera and just watch them and observe their social behaviors and take photos. And it became part of our family tradition. So in that way, I started to get really interested in how horses interact with each other. And then simultaneously, my little girls, my oldest, when they were 5 and 3, came to me and said, "We need to start riding lessons." And I'm not very comfortable around horses. I don't even know when you would start riding lessons. I didn't know anything about it, but they pressed me. And I finally found a barn very close by. And eventually they started lessons, and they absolutely got bitten by the horse bug immediately. And they have been riding for about 3, maybe more than 3 years now, weekly. And so while they were riding, I was bumming around with our little one around the barn and just watching these horses and just getting more and more interested in, again, their behavior. And so that kind of transitioned into, then of course the girls started collecting all of these horse books. And then we were reading all these horse books together. And the more we read, the more I wanted to read, and started exploring not just their natural history, but how they influenced the history of our country. And that got me to thinking that it would be interesting, since the girls loved horses, to design a unit study for our homeschool that revolved around horses. And so I started doing more reading and trying to pull together resources. And I realized this information is spread out all over the place. I thought maybe I'd find a book or two where it was all in here, how the horse throughout the U.S. history. And there was information out there, but it was all over the place. And so I realized that it was something that was kind of unique, a kind of unique way of looking at our history, and put together this unit study for the girls at their level, elementary school level. But I thought that it opened up so many possibilities for including different figures in history, women, people of color, who are often left out of traditional histories. It kind of allowed me to include them in the story. And I thought, I think a lot of people are going to be interested in this. I should put it together as a book for adults and for teens. So that's how it got started.
That's so interesting. I think North Carolina would be, Wyoming, and I live in that area, so I know there's the wild horses out here in Nevada, places like that. But North Carolina seems like an unlikely place to find horses to me. I don't know why. But.
Yes. And interestingly, there are a lot of great books about wild horses, but most of them are focused exclusively on the wild horses of the West. And so it was interesting for me to explore more about some of the horses on our Eastern Barrier Islands as well while I was researching.
That's cool. Well, so how is your book different? You said that you went through this whole discovery of finding out like you couldn't find the exact information that you wanted to on horses. So how is your book different than other horse books that are out there?
So it's different in that, in a couple of ways. One, it's sort of a combination of, it starts 55 million years ago with the natural history of the horse. So it starts long before there was the United States of America. But the horse evolved across the Great Plains. And so it starts there. And then it moves forward through its extinction in North America, its reintroduction by the Spanish explorers and colonists. And then it talks about the profound consequences of the native peoples of the plains acquiring the horses from these Spanish colonists and becoming incredible mounted warriors, and then really kind of changing the history of the continent by keeping the Europeans at bay from colonizing the Great Plains and sort of stopping the Spanish colonization in its tracks. And then from there, it follows the arc of the country's history the next 300 years in sort of a survey of American history and how the horse actually contributed, not was just present, but actually was a big driver in shaping the development of our country. And so it combines, like I said, science, history, literature, policy to give this sort of big overarching picture of the horse's influence.
That's really cool. I mean, out in the West, a lot of people still ride horses, and there are lots of horses around because of how spread out the land is. I mean, if we didn't have that kind of transportation. But I think, in the eastern side, that maybe, like I said, it just seems like it's kind of being lost from that history. I had no idea. For some reason, I just thought that, this is how much I've studied horses, but I thought that the horses were here and wild, and the Indians were the ones that taught the new settlers.
Right. I had never thought about it at all. I thought until a few years ago, I thought wild horses were really a legend or just something that was completely historical, that I didn't even realize there were still all these wild horses all over the place. But yeah, they were not here. They were reintroduced, and then the native peoples of the plains spread them to each other, and then they would and in the process, of course, there wasn't fencing or anything back in the 1700s. And so in the process, they would lose a lot of them, and they also would steal. There was a lot of stealing going on. And so they would stampede someone else's horses, and half of them would run away, and then they'd take the other half. And so there was this constant losing, stealing, transferring, trading going on that spread them relatively quickly up from New Mexico, Texas, all the way up to the Great Plains to Canada.
You always hear about the wild Mustang of America, and so I just figured that there were just, they were like wild animals, and then we domesticated them or something.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the last horse species to die out in North America before luckily it walked across the Bering Strait, the Bering Bridge, land bridge to Asia and to Europe before it died out in North America. There's been so it is a different species than our modern horse. It used to be at least considered a different species. It has a different name, but more recent mitochondrial DNA testing has shown that it's actually genetically equivalent to our modern horse. And so the same horse that died out 8,000 years ago, it's, that's the same species that the Spanish brought back. So there is this debate, and I go through it, I talk about it in the book about whether the horse should be considered a native species because it evolved here and then died out here, partially because of human hunting that was going on, partially because of a changing climate that made it difficult to live here. But and then humans sort of played a part in its die-off, and then they brought back the same species. So should that be considered native or non-native? Or what I talk about in the book, what I suggest is that a reintroduced native species is the best way to describe it. But different government agencies consider it in different ways and label it differently. And then that has policy implications because we treat animals differently that are non-native rather than native. So it's a very interesting discussion when you look at, you dig a little deeper into that natural history.
Yeah, this is a fascinating book already for me because you've taught me so many things. We're talking about your book, but I'm still interested in knowing what, the homeschooling journey was like for you. We talked about your children when they were young and trying to, what's that challenge that you have when you're encountering that homeschooling situation with all of the writing and research that you're doing? What have you learned from the experience of the homeschooling journey?
Well, in terms of homeschooling itself, I would say something that I've learned through that is that even though so my oldest daughter went to a public kindergarten, and then I decided that we would try homeschooling and a public school kindergarten. And so even though my goal was to try to do something different than the experience that she was getting in the classroom, I found myself, which I think is really common, sort of immediately trying to emulate a classroom in our home. And that doesn't always work. It's kind of boring.
For everybody involved. Right?
Exactly, for everyone. And so, and when you're teaching 2 or 3 kids, it can be a very different experience than when a classroom teacher is teaching 20 or 30 kids and trying to measure their growth. And so you don't need to be emulating a classroom. And so what I found was that what gets people the most engaged and interested, both the kids and me, is when we can find something that we all want to learn about and that we can learn about together. And so that was one thing with this horse unit study, is I was getting increasingly interested in horses as they were getting increasingly interested in horses. And so it was something that we could learn about together, and we got super into it. We also do a lot of nature study together, nature journaling, where we draw something and we learn little facts about it and stuff. And if I just say, okay, girls, go do your nature journal, it's not very inspired. But if I sit down with them and we work together, then we all have a great time and create something that we're all really proud of. So that's probably one of my biggest moments of growth, was kind of this realization that I don't need, to have my whiteboard up and everything. We can just sit together and learn about things we're interested in together. And so, and then in terms of trying to find balance, I'm not very good at finding balance. But what I have found is, so on a day-to-day basis, we often do our sort of formal schooling in the mornings when we're all fresh, and we all have the energy to do that together. And then we do sort of a quiet time in the afternoon, which is never actually quiet because no one in my family is quiet, but that's the goal, is that the girls are either working on something something educational that they can do independently, or they're just playing and building Legos and going outside and playing or something while I get some work done. And then I often work in the evenings as well, once they're in bed. But sometimes, I don't plan out. Some people have very strict schedules. We're going to do 3 weeks on, and then we're going to take 2 days off, that type of thing. And unless we're going on a trip or something, it's generally a school day. But then when I have something that I really need to finish, or when we're all just kind of burnt out and need a break, then we take a day off. So I just keep it very flexible like that. So that when something comes up, we can do what needs to be done. Either we can work really intensely on our schoolwork or on my work, or we can just take time off and take a break that we need.
And I think it's awesome when you can teach yourself through this experience and then pass it on to your children, of really monitoring that, how you're feeling emotionally and mentally and all that stuff. I think that's really powerful. I love this idea because I'm really trying to get more into that. Like, how do we mentor education for our kids? I love the idea of that unit study where you're both. That's very true. If you're not interested and they're not interested, why do we study? And I find too, like with a unit study, the cool thing is, like, you may study horses, for instance, but I'm sure you can tell us that it branched into, so many things like biology and history.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
All of that kind of stuff. That's great. How do you feel like your paradigm has changed, with time and experience with that?
Yes.
I mean, you were kind of talking about that at the beginning, classroom, but.
Yes. So related to that, so when, I guess specifically thinking about history and about, pulling together the study that then turned into the book, when I decided that I wanted us to study some U.S. history, I started to look through some popular curriculum options and popular history books. And I was not very impressed by them. I was kind of shocked that in 2020, a lot of people are still using the same sort of materials and from the same sort of narrow traditional perspective that was, in the classroom when I was growing up, 20, 30 years ago.
And a lot of it's really boring.
A lot of it's so boring. And it's all about, it's like it's a lot of memorizing and regurgitating. So facts about, dates, battles, victors, and usually those traditional histories I'm kind of talking about are written by the victor, and so they're a very narrow view. And so I just kind of scrapped that. And that was, why I started thinking about doing this horse unit study. And then the more I read, the more I realized I can tell stories of interesting women whose, stories are often not told. And, people of color, these Native Americans. I found that a fourth of cowboys in the West during the heyday were Black, but most literature and film cut them out.
That's interesting.
And so anyway, it just really allowed me to tell history from a different angle. And of course, there are people who write, all different perspectives of history. But when I was looking at what was seeming very popular, it concerned me that a lot of people are not choosing those perspectives. And so I guess this book is I'm putting it out there as one example of how shifting our lens and looking at a different perspective can really enrich our understanding of what actually happened and how our country actually came to be. And I think also I try to connect events. We often also study history in very discrete events, like let's do a unit on the gold rush, and then let's zoom ahead to this other unit about, now let's talk about the American Revolution. And we don't talk about how one thing leads to another. And so we're not really
carrying your action,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're just kind of regurgitating instead of actually critically thinking about how one thing led to another and what that teaches us about how we got to where we are today. So I tried to do that in the book, sort of connect these events using the horse as a narrative thread.
That's interesting. Well, and I'd like to talk about that. Like, what's the most, is the understanding that a lot of those cowboys were Black, was that the most interesting thing? Or is there something else that you feel like was really interesting, or what was really unexpected about that? Do you want to pinpoint that? Discuss that.
There were so many interesting things that I found out along the way that I had no idea about. And then when I had early readers reviewing the book for me, pretty much all of them said, I learned something on almost every page that I thought I had a decent, understanding of U.S. history, but I learned something on every page. So it felt like at every corner, there was something interesting like that. One thing that I found fascinating was that oftentimes when we see an image, depicting Native Americans of the plains. So I refer to them as the horse nations in the book, the Native Americans who acquired horses, and then their culture sort of began to revolve around them. And that you see men shooting arrows from the horse, you see them hunting, but Native American women of the horse nations were often also expert riders. And
the women were? Is that
the women were as well?
Oh,
yes.
Awesome.
And so, they were hunting buffalo. They were capturing wild horses. They were sometimes actually fighting in battles. And so that's not part of the narrative that I had heard before. So that was one thing that was really interesting. On a personal level, I actually uncovered something about my personal family history, which was very unexpected.
That's really cool.
Which was that, so like I said, I grew up in Minnesota, but I've lived in North Carolina for much of my adult life now. So we have spent a lot of time on our Outer Banks, as I said, and have been familiar with the legend of how the wild horses got there. And the legend is that in the 1500s or 1600s, Spanish horses swam ashore from sinking Spanish ships.
Oh,
and I had never really questioned that because it's such a romantic story. I thought, wow, let's just go with that. I love that story.
Yeah.
And so, but I thought, well, I better dig a little deeper and see if there is some truth to that. And so what I found was that, so we have off our coast, the shipwreck explanation is feasible because there are at least 1,000 shipwrecks right off the Outer Banks in what's called the graveyard of the Atlantic, because there's a lot of violent storms and there are shallow shoals, sandbars. And so a lot of ships get washed up on the sandbars and wrecked. There's documentation of, ships that have sunk that had horses on them, horses that were washed off the deck of ships, and then also of the ships themselves washing up on the Outer Banks. But there's not evidence that particular horses that made it ashore and survived and then reproduced and created this entire population out there. So there's not evidence of that. But what we know is that there was a really unique population of settlers that lived just on the mainland, just west of the Outer Banks, in the mid 1600s, that was made up of Native Americans, some runaways from the law, formerly enslaved peoples and people running from slavery, and Quakers who were escaping religious persecution in Virginia. And so there was this really kind of unique community there, and they were mostly small-time farmers. Many of them had horses, and they started pasturing their horses out on the Outer Banks and in areas where there are still horses today. And I guess England had imposed a fencing tax in 1670. And so if you built a fence, you had to pay a tax. And so no one could afford that. So they started using islands to put their horses on, since you don't need a fence to keep a horse on an island. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, and then eventually they ended up abandoning some of the horses out there, who are then thought to be. So there may have been horses from shipwrecks out there, but then these early settlers also put the horses out. But what I found, I was reading this and I thought, this sounds really vaguely familiar to me. And a light bulb went off, and I realized that I knew that I had ancestors who had settled in North Carolina in the 1600s, and they were Quaker. And I started thinking, wait a minute, this sounds a little bit familiar. And I ran to my bookshelf in my living room and pulled off a book that my great aunt wrote about our family history. And sure enough, I had family that were part of this community that ended up putting the first horses on the Outer Banks. And I don't know I don't know if I'll ever know whether my family in particular did, but certainly their community did. And I thought that was just so neat that my own family has this personal connection, that we go and visit these horses. And it turns out that my ancestors, may have had a hand in actually putting them out there. So I was kind of floored by that.
That's interesting. That's like one of those things you're like, it's just destined to be.
Yes,
you find out this information, and and that you're feeling drawn to it, and you don't know why.
Yes, exactly.
That's so great. So tell me, what are 3 key messages that you want our readers to take away from your book? I mean, other than the fascinating history, and I mean, you told me a ton already, but
yeah. So I guess, we've kind of talked about some of them, but one, like I said, the horse just had this tremendous influence on our country's history and the whole development of the country. And so I think they deserve some attention, and some, they deserve to have their story told. They were not background players, but they were, essential main characters in our history. So that's one. And then another is just this idea, like I said, that if you are, most of us had this experience probably of having a fairly traditional history education, but that is such a narrow perspective. And so I think we should always be working to add perspectives to flesh out our understanding of what happened, because there was, and in many ways, this is just one little offering, one more perspective to add to our understanding. And then I guess the last thing, which is implicit in the book, but I don't actually state, but, I found that when I was writing it, and this is true of any topic, the more you learn about something, the more you realize how little you know. And so I hope that, somebody might read this and think, wow, there's so much in here I didn't know. And that sort of, gives them,
like
some
springboard.
Motivation. Exactly. Some motivation to say, hey, maybe I should read, pick something else in this book, some topic about these Native American women of the horse nations or something. And keep pursuing these different perspectives to sort of, to flesh out your own perspective.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I love having guests like you that really talk about, it's such a disruptive idea to think history is written by the winners. And so of course that's the history that we all learned, but there are people just like there are now that were doing amazing things that were kind of on the fringes of that society. And so I'm just so amazed. And I guess I'm just really curious I'll have to read your book to find out what's going to happen. And just so my audience knows, I just was looking before we even started recording, but that you're doing a launch party on May 14th. It's going to actually, this podcast will air after that.
Okay.
I'll definitely make sure that the Luminous Mind is participating in that airing. In that airing. So we will be able to find the book. I just don't want our audience to think like, oh, you think it's amazing, but you didn't. I can't read it.
No, you haven't gotten your hands on it yet.
Exactly. But what a neat idea. And I'm so glad that you took the time to flush out those ideas so that we know more about them, because it's really important for us to know that. I think it helps to give us courage. It helps to give us hope, especially, like I said, if you're kind of a person on the fringes of things like that.
Exactly.
Well, so I've spent a lot of time looking into your Instagram and your website, and of course the book, different things that you have on that. What fabulous pictures on your website, by the way.
You.
I mean, I can tell. I'm like, okay, she's definitely a photographer. But tell us what more people could possibly find on some of those social media channels.
So, so I'm very active on Instagram, especially. That's my favorite social media platform. Obviously, it's great for photography. And I do have a lot of my wild horse photography up there. Last summer, I went out to Wyoming and Montana, so your neck of the woods, and photographed the Pryor Mountain, the wild horses of the Pryor Mountains, which was amazing. And actually, the cover of the book is a wild stallion from the Pryor Mountains. So there's a lot of wildlife photography, and I'm also, so I do have this small photography business as well, and I do lifestyle and documentary style photography. I do portraiture, and there's also some nature photography up there as well. And I have a book that is a piece of curriculum. I don't like to call it a textbook because that sounds boring, but it's a course, a piece of curriculum it's called Documenting Your World Through Photography, and it's an intro photo course for kids, for elementary. I say it's for elementary and middle schoolers, but I have parents and high schoolers tell me all the time that they learned a lot from it. So it's so that is available as well, and I use my own photography portfolio as examples for all of the lessons.
That's cool.
That I offer. So.
Well, and I think what a great example. I mean, especially for the fact that you homeschool your kids, for them to see you do the research and then, put it into a form that can be helpful to other people, I think. And then that you offer that to us on things that you're just learning with your children every day. And then, the things that will help us. And it looks like a fabulous book again. Is that one of your daughters on the?
Yes, that's my middle
cover?
Daughter, Nora, on the cover. Yes.
Okay.
And in the end of the book, there's a chapter about storytelling through photography. So the book is about, it's about developing photography skills, but I think we can also use photography as a tool to teach kids how to hone their observation skills, to, still their minds, still their bodies, and just observe the world around them. And I think that's a really important skill. And then it also teaches storytelling, which of course we all need to be, regardless of whether we're writers or photographers, we need to be able to tell a good story to write a college essay, to apply to college, or write our cover letter to get a job, or, a scientist needs to be able to communicate their findings so that other people know what to do with, with the research that they, so anyway, I included a session that I did with Nora. I always do a session for the girls' birthdays on the beach, which is on the cover here. And I included how I put the story together in terms of visuals, and then also a blog post that I wrote about Nora and about that session. And so that's the last chapter in the book, encouraging kids to tell their own story through a series of images and writing.
Well, and I think nowadays we have that ability, like we were talking about the old history books, that a lot of us can learn those types of things more visually. And I think if we can all learn to be better storytellers through pictures and through, it has a powerful effect. I think that's why social media in general can be a very powerful thing, because, it's not just boring stories that you read in the newspaper, that a lot of times it includes pictures and stories of people and their lives, on top of that. So what a fabulous resource. Well, great. Well, tell us some feedback that you've received about the things that you offer with your website and how you're helping other people to be more successful.
Well, so the book, Equus Rising has not, as I said, it has not yet come out, but I've been really encouraged by all of the early reviewers and readers, people I've sent copies to, who have helped me out, and who have also, who have proofread, everybody who's been involved in this process. And as I said, I've just been very happy with the feedback that they have learned a lot, and it has from the book, in terms of both the facts themselves and and in sort of making connections that they had never made before between events that they'd never thought about. They'd always thought about them separately. So I'm happy about that. And then documenting your world through photography. It's been fun. I mean, people will send me or tag on Instagram pictures that their kids have taken. And these are little kids, and they'll take their parents' phone camera. And, you don't need anything fancy to the activities. And they'll just, go out in the yard and do these activities. And it's been really rewarding for me to see that, because I love sharing this information with people.
Well, and that's a cool thing too, like with our technology nowadays. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, so I grew up in the area of Polaroids or cameras that you couldn't see what you had produced for, weeks on end. So it's really, and children, I mean, your parents just did not hand over the camera because that was valuable film and, they didn't. So for kids to have access, to do the quantity of photos and then continue to improve, I think is an amazing thing. And then, like I said, when we can teach children to storytell through photos, I just think that we're going to become more, you're going to be able to reach a broader amount of people as well as get the story told the way that it needs to be delivered. So how fabulous. Well, kind of to wrap it up, I'd love to hear more kind of about you. What habits do you feel like in your personal life are the most helpful for you to better learn yourself?
That's a good question. I'm a very curious person. And so I am always wanting to learn more about how something works or why something is the way it is. I'm never quite satisfied with a basic explanation of something. And so I'm always looking things up. I'm always trying to find, reliable resources, which is something that we are just going to have to be teaching our kids in a different way than we learned, because you can just Google anything and you can get the answer you want to get, And so anyway, I'm always trying to find reliable sources of information. And and I consider myself a lifelong learner. I'm always wanting to learn something, and my husband is the same way. And so I think we both we both do that naturally, but now that we have kids, we try to model that for them. And so when we have a question about something, when we're curious, we say it out loud. We say, I want to learn more about this, and here's what I'm going to do to learn more about this. I'm going to look this up, and I have this book that I'm going to look at, and I'm going to look up on this website. And we show them, and we talk about, and we are excited that we are learning something. And we never say, if they ask us a question and we don't know, we never make up an answer. We say, I don't know, let's look it up. And so I think that we're trying to sort of create an environment where for our kids, if they are wondering something, they're not out of luck because they don't know the answer. We're trying to show them that you can always find the answer, and it's always worth your time to put the work in to learn something.
Well, I think, the whole paradigm change, I love that, because a lot of us come from an era where we felt like the teacher knew everything. And at least my background is that adults never confessed, basically.
Yep.
They didn't have the answer, or maybe the way that they handled that situation was probably not the best, or, there was always like, well, I'm an adult and I'm the one, and then you were just kind of following them. I remember hearing my mom say a lot, do as I say, not as I do.
Right.
But I think we all come to this as we are with our children and they're watching us, all of a sudden becomes a very awesome mirror. It's shockingly awesome. But, and then we shift our perspective of like, it's more important for them to learn how to learn and to watch me through that, to know that I don't know everything either. But because I have the curiosity and the humility, that I have the ability to learn that. And I guess that's why I want parents to come to that faster than,
yes,
than making a ton of mistakes and never getting to it. So.
Just believe us. Don't make a mistake.
Yes. Just go right to the curiosity and humility. Exactly. That's great. Well, tell me, you've already done a ton, but I'd love to hear like long-term goals, where you feel like you want to head your life now in kind of this direction, or in a different direction, or whatever. Same direction.
So I do, like I said, I feel like it's fun that my kids are getting more independent, so that I have more time to to work on these projects that I feel drawn to. And so I do have another book idea that I promised my family that I was going to take a break over the summer after this book launches, but I do have another book idea that I'd like to work on that has to do more with scientific literacy. And I've found as a science writer that a lot of people come out of school, and again, it goes back to the same idea as what we were talking about with history. If science to you is about regurgitating facts and doing a couple lab experiments, but mostly just memorizing the scientific names of plants or something like that, you kind of miss the big picture of what it actually is and what, evidence-based reasoning can do for us. And so anyway, I have an idea of kind of exploring that and sort of trying to explain for a lay person who's not a scientist, what actually is science, and where can we find value in it? So that is a project that I'm interested in. And then I actually just got the paperwork today, but I'm opening a small independent press publishing house, and I don't know where it's going to take me at all. And I do have one author who I'm already starting to work with, and I'm really excited about that. And so I don't know if it's something that I will grow into a much larger thing, or if I'll just sort of take, if somebody comes to me, but it's exciting because I want to publish more sort of, new voices, perspective shifting work, just like all of the things that we've been talking about, just to help people broaden their perspective and their views.
Well, and I mean, this COVID-19 situation has really made me see that we have to learn how to take the information that we're given, but then also research other ways. But so many of us feel like, if we don't follow the expert, or we don't follow, this general thing, that even though it may feel like our intuition is like something's not right here, whatever, that maybe can affect us in larger ways than we even know. And I think that's what I'm feeling like with this COVID-19, that not having a good grasp of, how scientific research is done, and having it said to the layman in the, we're not educated the way that we should. So I feel like you definitely, that's a niche that we need to follow for sure.
Yes, I think so. And we get confused too between what is science and what is politics. And so I think, but science itself is not, when done right, we're all humans, we make mistakes, scientists make mistakes, but when it's done right, it's not political. And then you can use science to back up your different political claims. But I think there's become this sort of mixing of thinking that science is politics. And I'd love to sort of separate those out and really talk about what science actually is. Yeah.
Well, and if it doesn't fit with that political narrative, then it's tossed out, or
right,
I don't,
exactly.
It's just become it's just so frustrating, because then you're like, am I getting good information, or just getting what your group wants me to know? So
right.
And
exactly.
The sad part is it's just made everybody really skeptical all the time. We don't know who we can trust, and what angle, they're going for here.
Exactly. And that's another sort of aspect that I want to discuss in the book is how to become a better consumer of science news specifically, because I think most of us want to be, we want to be better consumers of news, but there's so much noise out there that it's really hard to figure out who can we trust, who's actually reporting on the real science versus just making up their own analysis of it, when they're not really the experts, and how can we dig in to try to look a little closer at a study ourselves to see if what I'm reading is in a news story is actually aligned with the study itself. Yeah. So those are things that I'm really interested in trying to sort of break down for people, and also get better at myself.
Well, and my last thing too is like, I guess I want to use science to live not to just live longer. I think our parents have done that, but to live life healthier and more fully. You know what I mean? I don't want to just sit and take drugs and be alive, but not really be alive.
Right. Exactly. That only helps us so much.
Exactly. So just have a better life, I guess, is really important. So give us some parting words that you want our listeners to just leave with them, and then give us your contact information just so we know where to find all of these wonderful resources we've talked about.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll just sort of reiterate again, I just am such a believer in lifelong learning. And I think even as we talked about, whatever your traditional or whatever your educational background is, whether it was very traditional or whether maybe it was unconventional, you're not stuck with. We compartmentalize education. We think it's something that happens when we're enrolled as a student and when we're young. But really, we have the capacity to learn anything at any time. And I just encourage people to just continue to be lifelong learners and to model that for your kids so that they're always able to learn what they want to and need to live their best life.
That's great. And then your contact information?
Yes. So it's funny. I'm the only Julia Soplop on the web, maybe in the world. It's such an unusual name. So my website is juliasoplop.com. And like I said, Instagram is my favorite social media platform. So my Instagram handle is @JuliaSoplop, and that's a great place to find my work.
That's great. Well, it's been super fun chatting with you, Julia.
Thank you.
Again, it's Julia Soplop, the author of Equus Rising, How the Horse Shaped U.S. History. You can find out more on her website and social media connections as well. We're going to be sure to link all those on our show notes page, so be sure to check that out. But thank you so much again for coming on. I mean, what a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca. This has been so great.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Music featured in this episode from Scott Holmes. To learn more about our podcast, check us out at theluminousmind.net.